our next region. Okay, the diencephalon. This is one of your answers on your quiz. Right? Right. Okay. So the diencephalon is right here in the middle of the brain, and it includes three basic parts. It includes the thalamus, right here in the middle, that we'll start talking about, the epithalamus back here at the back, and the hypothalamus down there in the front. Okay? But all three of those together make up the diencephalon. We are going to look at each of those parts and what they do. Your objective for this says to know the three areas, know where they are, and their functions. Okay? So that was just a picture of where they are. Here are their functions. So the thalamus is this guy right here. If we have taken off the cerebrum and we're just looking at him all in one piece. When you did your sheep brain dissection, or if you cut the brain in half like was on the other slide, what you're doing is you're cutting right here this way. And so what you're going to see is into these big ovals on either side, but they project out into the cerebrum. Okay? The cerebrum, or sorry, the thalamus is going to make up 80% of the diencephalon, so the majority of the diencephalon is this thalamus. We have two big oval masses of gray matter. If it's gray matter, is it myelinated? No. So what part of the neuron is going to be found there in the thalamus? Is it going to be the cell body or the axons? Cell body. Or what type of axon? Unmyelinated. Good. Okay. And they're going to enclose the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is going to lie right between the two parts of that thalamus. Okay, so what does the thalamus do? He is called the gateway to the cerebral cortex. So any information that is coming from the body into the cerebrum has to pass through the thalamus. So it gets sent there first and then gets sent to the cerebrum. Okay, so he is that gateway, the pathway into the cerebrum. Okay, so motor information is going down through the thalamus, and then sensory information is coming up through the thalamus into the cerebrum, except for smell, which is going to enter a little bit differently. Okay, so that's the thalamus. All right, next area is your hypothalamus. He's going to sit down below and in front of your thalamus. And attached to your hypothalamus is your pituitary gland, which we'll spend a whole lot more time talking about when we get to the endocrine system. But the hypothalamus helps control that pituitary gland and tell him when to secrete his hormones. Okay? So the hypothalamus, what he does, control center for the autonomic nervous system. So the things that you're not controlling by thinking about them. Okay? So not your voluntary movements, but your automatic movements instead. Okay? He also helps control the endocrine system by controlling that little pituitary gland guy. And he plays a huge role in homeostasis. So when we talked about thermoregulation, we've talked about that multiple times this semester. We said your body wants to keep your temperature at a constant 98.6 degrees, right? If you get too hot, if you're above that set point, what's your body going to do? How are you going to get back to homeostasis? Sweat, which some of y'all might be doing in here because it's a little warm today. Okay, so you're going to sweat to bring it back down to 98.6. What happens if you're below it? You'll shiver. Those muscle movements will bring it back up to 98.6. So the part of your body that says 98.6 degrees is what I want my temperature at, and what tells the rest of your body what to do to make it 98.6 degrees is your hypothalamus. Okay? So this portion of the brain is saying 98.6. Sensory information comes in that says, I'm too cold, and the hypothalamus sends a signal that says, you need to sweat. If sensory information comes in, it says, did I say that backwards? Yeah, okay. So if sensory information comes in and says you're too hot, then your hypothalamus says you're going to need to sweat. If sensory information comes in that says you're too cold, the hypothalamus is going to send out information that says you need to start shivering. Okay? So your hypothalamus is that temperature regulator. He is the thermostat. He's going to make the changes. Okay? The hypothalamus also helps you regulate your food and water intake. So your hypothalamus is going to be what tells you you're hungry, unless you get your tummy all grumbly so you won't eat. It also tells you when you're full so you don't overeat. Okay? And it tells you when you're thirsty, when you need water. Cardiovascular regulation. So it helps maintain your set point for blood pressure and for heart rate and things like that. It's your center for sleep and waking. So setting your circadian rhythm, making sure you sleep at night, you're awake during the day. And this is going to come up a little bit later, but it's also part of the seat for your emotional behavior. So when you get angry, the behaviors that go along with that anger. When you get sad, the behaviors that go along with that sadness, with crying, all that stuff. So it's connecting the emotion to the behavior of that emotion. Okay? When you get anxious, it's what causes you to have hypertension, to have high blood pressure. All right. So it's a hypothalamus. And then the last part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. Okay? And the epithalamus, remember, is back here, back behind the thalamus. Okay? There are only two major things that epithalamus is doing. Not much going on here. Okay, the pineal gland. Did you guys see your pineal gland when you did your sheep brain dissection? Okay. Did you take your brain before you cut them in half and take the cerebrum and the cerebellum and pull them apart, and you can see the little pineal gland tongue sticking out there? It's one of my favorite things to do. Okay, so the pineal gland is back in here. He sticks his little tongue out right there, and his job. Okay, so his job is to secrete melatonin, which helps regulate your sleep cycles. Okay, so it helps you make sure you go to sleep at a good time. So if you're having problems sleeping, someone might suggest that you take melatonin supplements. So you can take that chemical modulator that will help make you sleep better. Okay. And then the other thing here that's in the epithalamus is the choroid plexus. And it's on the list for the epithalamus, but choroid plexus is found in multiple locations throughout the brain. Everywhere you have a ventricle, you have a choroid plexus. In the picture, it's this red guy right up here. And his job is to make cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And we're going to talk lots about what CSF does here in a little bit. All right, so now we have talked about your cerebrum, higher order thinking, motor control, things like that. We've done your diencephalon. Now, we're going to move on to your brainstem. So the farther down we go, the less control you have over what's going on. Okay? So these are going to be more of the involuntary things that are going to be controlled by the brainstem. Okay? So to orient you to where we're looking, this was on your quiz. It's this green part down here, just up in there. This picture is with the cerebrum taken off. Okay, so there's your thalamus we just looked at. We're right underneath it. Three parts are included in the brainstem. Your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla oblongata, which is a fun thing to say. Okay, so what do these things do? Okay, so the midbrain, located between the diencephalon, up here where your thalamus is, and your pons, so it's right there in the middle. He is the location of the pathways for your fear and your fight or flight response. Okay, so it's going to be located here in the midbrain. You also have reflex centers. So again, when you pull the cerebrum apart from the cerebellum and you saw your little pineal gland, do you remember seeing your corpora quadrigemina, the superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, all sitting there near the tongue? Yeah. Okay. So these guys have a cool function. The superior colliculi, the two knots up there at the top, they're responsible for your visual reflex. And that's what helps you track things with your eye. So when you're reading, you have a visual reflex to go down the line. You don't really have to think about it, it just happens. When you're watching, let's see, when you're watching somebody walk in front of you, your eyes follow that person. Okay, so that's visual reflex. It happens in the superior colliculi. Okay, then the inferior colliculi is responsible for your startle reflex. So it's an auditory reflex. If you hear a loud noise somewhere, you're going to turn your head to figure out what the loud noise is. Okay? That's your startle reflex. Also found in the midbrain is your substantia nigra. It contains melanin. Remember talking about him in your skin. It's a dark color. But melanin is a precursor for dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that helps control lots of things in your body. But people with Parkinson's disease don't make enough dopamine. So what are some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease? You guys know? Shakiness. Lots of shakiness. That's usually how it starts. My father-in-law actually has Parkinson's, the really early onset Parkinson's that he has. But one of his first symptoms was a little bit of shaking, but dragging one of his legs. He couldn't pick it up to move it the way he was supposed to. So one leg would work fine, and then he'd drag the next leg to move along. And so the dopamine is important in your brain to be used in some other part that we talked about on Monday. So what part of your cerebrum is responsible for making controlled muscle movements? It was the deep things, the basal nuclei. Okay? So those were the nuclei that were located deep in the cerebrum. Okay? So they have to have the substantia nigra working right so that they can get their dopamine so that they can control your muscle movements and keep them smooth. Okay? And then we also have in your midbrain some descending motor pathways. So sending information down to the rest of your body and how to move. All right, we are moving right along today. The pons is your next part. Pons means a bridge, so it's a connector. We have lots of gray matter there. It's going to contain nuclei concerned with sleep, posture, respiration, swallowing, and bladder control. See how we're getting to more things where they're autonomic things that you're not really thinking about. Like you don't usually think about posture. It's there. Okay. You don't think about respiration usually. It just happens. Bladder control. You don't think about it until you've had too much coffee to drink in the morning, and then you start thinking about bladder control. But up until that point, the pons is taken care of. Okay. Signals from the cerebrum are going to pass through here to get to the cerebellum, which we'll talk about in a second. So it's a connector from one place to another. All right, so we're moving down a little bit farther. The last stop on the brain is the medulla oblongata. Okay? And this is where we're going to throw everything that we have left that is involuntary. Okay? So this is going to be the part of your brain that controls all the other things that you don't really think about during the day that just happen. Okay? So the nuclei of the medulla oblongata control coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, sweating, vomiting, cardiac center, vasomotor center, and the respiratory center. So we're controlling the heart. We're controlling vasomotor, which is the diameter of your blood vessels. So controlling your blood pressure. And respiratory center, controlling how you breathe, how fast, how slow, things like that. Okay. So if you, yeah.
So I know that people said couldn't sweat. So is that like it not the signal's not getting out, or are they not providing?
So there's a couple different options for a non-sweating deformity. I don't know how you say it. It's not really a deformity. I guess you're not normal. Anyway, so it could be a brain issue where your brain isn't getting the information and sending the signal out right to sweat. It could be they don't have the glands that are producing sweat. So it could be anywhere along the pathway of brain to sweat glands and back. Yeah, anything about that. All right. So if you are going to get a brain injury, let's just say, would you rather have a brain injury in your cerebrum or in your medulla oblongata? Probably your cerebrum, right? Because you're still going to be alive, right? Hopefully, yeah. Okay. If you get an injury in more of your brainstem area, like your medulla oblongata, you're starting to lose very important things like respiration and your circulatory system. Okay, so you can handle more injuries to your cerebrum than you can to your brainstem. Now, is it good to have a brain injury in your cerebrum? No, but you may come out alive, which is quality. All right, so we've got the cerebrum, we've got the diencephalon, we've got the brainstem. We only have one little guy left. The cerebellum means little brain, so he's one little guy. Okay, so cerebellum is left. So let's talk about him real quick. He is the largest part of the hindbrain. So hindbrain is a term we use often in zoology when we're talking about animal brains and in the development of animals. The hindbrain is pretty important with regulating some of those autonomic features. So cerebellum is the biggest part controlling your autonomic responses, okay? You have, as far as anatomy goes, a right and left hemisphere of the cerebellum, just like your cerebrum. So in our picture here, here is one hemisphere, and here is one hemisphere over on the other side. And they're connected in the middle with a vermis, okay, which is that just area there in the middle. Vermis is worm. So if you look at it, he kind of looks like a little worm with his little ridges on it that goes down the middle, which is kind of gross. And then as far as the rest of the anatomy goes, there are 3 paired cerebellar peduncles, and peduncles are just connectors. Okay? So they're the feet, they connect them to the brainstem, and you can see them right through here. So it's just connecting the cerebellum, the little brain, to the rest of the brain, to the brainstem right there. Okay? But what does he do? He is going to help modulate and coordinate voluntary movement of the limbs. I'm just going to say that, and then we're going to get back to that on the next slide. Okay, it's going to make more sense. Just write it down for now. Okay. Secondly, he helps maintain muscle tone and posture. So he's also going to help with that, keeping your muscles ready to go. Remember, we talked about muscle tone, that your muscles are always a little bit contracted so that they will be ready to be used when necessary. He also helps coordinate your eye movements, which remember are super, super precise. There's lots of little eye muscles around there. And he also helps in learning of motor skills. So learn tasks that involve motor coordination. So playing a sport would be done with the cerebellum. You learn how to swing a golf club. You learn how to swing a baseball bat. You learn how to do certain movements. Learning how to play an instrument would also be there in the cerebellum. Okay? So let's talk about this first one. Modulates and coordinates the voluntary movement of the limbs. Okay, this is not part of an objective. It's just explaining this one phrase that's on the slide. Okay, so this isn't anything you have to memorize, just a picture to explain what we're doing here. Okay, so we want to control and modulate our motor information. Our motor information is primarily going to come from our primary motor cortex, which is up there. Remember, we saw the homunculus of what areas it controls of your body. But it's going to send a signal that says, contract this muscle so that you can have arm flexion. Okay, so contract the biceps brachii so that you can have arm flexion. Okay? He's going to send his information down to the palms. Because the palms is that little high bay connector, he's going to send information back and forth. The palms is going to send that information to the cerebellum. Okay, so now the cerebellum says, okay, I need to flex my arm. But the cerebellum is also going to get information from vestibular pathways, which are your inner ears that tell you where you are in relationship to everything. It's your balance. Auditory pathways, what are you hearing around you? Visual pathways, what are you seeing around you? Okay, so we've got our senses feeding into the cerebellum. We also have the reticular formation. We'll just say that he's there. We'll talk about what he is in a second. And we have muscle and joint proprioceptors. So information coming back from the bicep that says, I'm already partially contracted. Okay? That goes to the spinal cord and then into the cerebellum. So now the cerebellum has all this information. This is the movement I want to do. But this is what's going on around me at the time. So then, the cerebellum will take that, put all of it together, and say, okay, in order to get that movement to happen, I need to contract my muscle this much. I need to give it this much force for this much time. Okay? So the cerebellum will decide what to do, and then send the information back out to the muscle to actually cause the muscle to happen, to contract or do whatever it's supposed to do. Okay? So that's looking at just one muscle contracting at a time. But when we talk about very complex movements, like standing up here and talking, that cerebellum is working constantly. Okay, monitoring what's going on around you, and then modifying the information that you're getting from the cortex so that it will actually make a good movement, a good smooth movement. You're not overshooting the movement that you need to make. You're not undershooting the movement you need to make. You're going to do a good job. Okay? All right. So those are all of the parts of the brain, looking at them as little discrete chunks. Okay, so we talked about the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Okay. But, always a but, right? The brain doesn't work as discrete units. It likes to talk to each other and likes to use what are you good at, what are you good at, what are you good at, and they make connections together. Okay? So we're going to talk about 2 of these functional brain systems. So they're going to be systems that are made by taking different parts of the brain and linking them together. But there are multiples of these functional brain systems in your brain working right now. All right, so for these, in your objectives, you do not need to know where they are on a diagram because they're pretty complicated. Okay, you just need to know what's their function, what do they do. So our first one we're going to look at is the limbic system. You might have heard about the limbic system before. Okay, so loop of cortical structures surrounding your corpus callosum and your thalamus, and it's labeled in the red on here. So you've got your hypothalamus is important here. We've got your amygdala is involved in here. Lots of different things. The purpose of your limbic system is for your personality. Okay, so the majority of your personality is housed right here in your limbic system. So if you are primarily an optimistic person, it's because of your limbic system. If you're primarily a pessimistic person, it's because of your limbic system. Now, we could get into discussions of nature versus nurture and how much of your personality is genetic, how much of it has been passed down to you, and is based on the biology and physiology of this limbic system, and how much of it is based on how you have been nurtured and cared for over the time that you've been alive, and really it's a combination of the two. Okay, they play a role in shaping each other. Okay, because your environment and your nature, the nurture can shape the nature and how you develop and how your brain becomes what it is. Okay, but we have found that personality is linked to this limbic system. So the limbic system is important for emotions such as fear, anger, love, all those lovely things. Okay, and notice the hippocampus is mixed in there, or not the hippocampus, the hypothalamus is mixed in there. And remember, the hypothalamus was linking emotions to the physical end of things. Okay, so it's all in there in the limbic system. Okay, but we're taking parts of multiple areas of the brain and linking them all together to have a big function. Okay. And our second functional system, our last one we're going to talk about, is the reticular formation. Notice that we've got lines going everywhere all over that brain. Okay, and that's because the reticular formation is all over the brain. Okay, we have lots of different parts being used together. It's a group of about 100 nuclei, so patches of gray matter that are scattered throughout the brain. It's found in the medulla, the midbrain, and the pons that function in a somatic motor control, autonomic control, arousal, and pain modulation. Okay, so you're getting information in from the body through your senses, and you are adapting to it. Okay, one of the big things you're doing here is arousal. So the reticular formation helps keep your brain active. Okay, it makes sure that you're not just sitting there not thinking. Okay, can you not think? Can you sit there and just not think about anything? Okay, because your brain is constantly working, it's constantly doing its thing. The reticular formation is turned off primarily when you sleep. Okay, it's what helps to slow you down so that you can actually go to sleep. But when you're awake and you're aroused, your reticular formation is part of what's causing you to be awake and aroused. Yeah. What causes dreams? Well, that's a debated fact. So it may involve a little bit of this, and they're still trying to figure out exactly what it is that causes dreams. We won't worry about it. No, I like curiosity too. So what this reticular formation does is it sends little bursts of energy, little tiny nervous system signals into that cortex to keep it aroused, awake, and ready to go. Okay? Along with the reticular formation, part of what it is, or a component of the reticular formation, is the RAS, or the reticular activating system. And his job is to filter out unwanted stimuli. So right now, while you're sitting in this room, your sensory input is picking up everything that's happening. It's picking up all the sounds. It's picking up all the smells. It's picking up the feeling of your clothes on your body. It's picking up the feeling of your watch and your rings and where your hair is sitting. It's picking up everything. It's picking up what your stomach is doing right now and what your muscles are doing. Okay, but not all that information is important. Okay, you don't need to know every second of the day that you are wearing a watch, right? Sometimes you need to forget. You don't need to worry about it. So this RAS helps filter out some of that unwanted information. It helps your brain decide what do I need to worry about versus what do I not need to worry about. This also helps you pay attention. So you are focused on a small amount of things instead of all of the things. Okay? All right. those are the parts of the brain itself. We're going to move on to some more things. So our next stop will be in the meninges. So hopefully you saw these in lab. And did y'all have to cut them off of your brain to look at it? Yes. Okay. So the meninges are protective layers that are covering your brain. There are 3 layers. And they help separate the brain and spinal cord from the bones. So from the skull and from the vertebrae. They also help hold in your cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll get to in a second. Okay, and you've got 3 layers. The first layer that you would see if you cut into somebody and cut up in their skull is the dura mater. Okay? It is tough, it's a protective outer layer, and it's probably what you cut through to get to the sheep brain. It's pretty thick. It's made of fibrous connective tissue, and dura mater means tough mother. Mater is mother. Okay, then underneath there is the arachnoid mater. You probably couldn't really see this because of the way it's fixed, but the arachnoid mater looks like a spider's web. That's why it's called the arachnoid mater, because arachnoid is a spider. So it's like a little spider web under there. A mesh-like network between the outer and inner layers of the meninges, and that's where your cerebrospinal fluid is going to be. They're in the arachnoid mater. Okay. So it's not a dense sheet. It's like a little spider web through the middle. And then your last one is pia mater. The pia mater is closely associated with the brain itself. So it sits right there on the surface. So during your sheep brain dissection, you probably couldn't pick the pia mater off of the brain. If you picked the pia mater off the brain, you probably dug into the brain tissue and made it a mess. Right? That happens. Okay. It's highly vascularized. It's where your capillaries are going to be located. And it follows the contours of the brain. So it goes over the gyri, and into the sulci. Okay. Really, really close. And the next slide, I've got a picture. So, if this is your skull, or sorry, the skin of your scalp, then the next layer is the skull. But remember, the bones have a layer of periosteum on either side. Okay, so you'll hit the periosteum, you'll hit the bone, you'll have another layer of periosteum. When we look at the brain, the dura mater of the brain, we say that it has 2 layers, a periosteal layer, which is the periosteum of the bone, and a meningeal layer. And that meningeal layer is more of the dura mater that's separating the brain. Okay, then underneath there you have your arachnoid mater. See how it's like spider web, little fibers all through there? We've got our blood vessels running through there, our large vessels. And then the pia mater is right there, all along the surface of the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. He is a fluid that is clear, he's colorless, and he is surrounding your central nervous system. So he surrounds the brain, and he goes in all those little ventricles, all the holes in the brain, and he also surrounds your spinal cord, and he goes through that middle hole in the spinal cord as well. Okay, his purpose, he lends to buoyancy. What does it mean to say something is buoyant? It floats. So, your book says, I hadn't heard this before, but your book says it, so it must be true. It says that if your brain wasn't sitting in CSF, then it would squish itself. Because neural tissue is so flimsy. You saw the sheep brain, right? You felt it. It was kind of squishy. That the weight of the brain would squish the bottom parts of the brain. So because it's sitting in cerebrospinal fluid, it kind of floats. And it's floating in there, so it weighs less. Okay?
Oh, so there's like, it makes sense about concussion. Because like, not one side, it goes against the front.
Yeah, so, and in concussion, it goes against both sides. So it's floating in there, right? And when you hit in like a car accident or an injury on a playing field, you hit in one direction, your brain slides forward and hits the front of your skull, but then it ricochets back, and then it hits the back of your skull. So you end up with the brain just flying everywhere. It's lovely. Okay, which can cause many injuries. Okay, the cerebrospinal fluid helps protect it because it cushions and surrounds the brain. It removes the waste from the brain cells, or your neurons. Once they're produced, they go out into the cerebrospinal fluid. And it also helps provide a stable chemical environment, which we'll get to in a second. But there is a barrier between your cerebrospinal fluid and your blood. Not everything that's in your blood can get into your cerebrospinal fluid. So things in your blood change very frequently. When you eat, blood sugar changes. You get a spike in blood sugar when you eat a sugary meal. You're going to get lots of different vitamins and minerals and ions and all those things changing very, very quickly in your blood as a response to the environment. But your cerebrospinal fluid is very, very stable. Okay? It has a set number of ions, inside, outside, is all balanced. Okay? There's only a few things that can get into that cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? The cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus, which we saw a little bit ago, but it's found within each ventricle. So every ventricle has its own choroid plexus to produce its own cerebrospinal fluid. What the choroid plexus is a bunch of capillaries, so blood vessels, covered by simple cuboidal epithelium. So there is a little joining space there where the blood comes in, and then the fluid is pulled from the blood to make up that cerebrospinal fluid. But those simple cuboidal epithelium make sure that there's only certain things within the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? Between the simple cuboidal epithelial cells are super tight junctions. So things can't just slide between them. They have to actually go through the cell. Okay? And so that helps regulate the ions, the nutrients, all those things within the cerebrospinal fluid. So if we look at a picture of production, here is a choroid plexus. There's a choroid plexus. There's a choroid plexus. They're all going to be red because they're highly vascularized. There's a bunch of capillaries sitting here. Okay, so that's where cerebrospinal fluid will be produced. And then the cerebrospinal fluid will filter out around in the ventricles, but then flow around the raccoon water, fill out around the outside of the brain, and eventually end up back in your blood supply. It goes back into a vein. Okay? Lining your ventricles are going to be cells with cilia on them, so they beat and they push that cerebrospinal fluid all around the brain. So it's continually moving, continually carrying things back and forth. Okay. Blood-brain barrier. This is what I was talking about a second ago. So the brain is very metabolically active. Okay, our brain is doing lots of stuff. We already talked about that earlier in this chapter. Okay, and so it has a high demand for oxygen and glucose. It's working a lot, so it needs a lot of energy. Stopping the blood supply to the brain for as little as 4 minutes can cause irreversible brain damage. Okay. So what is it called when you stop blood supply to the brain? A stroke, yeah. And we'll talk about the different types of stroke. Ischemic stroke is one of those. Okay, so we can cut off the blood supply to the whole brain, or we can cut off the blood supply to different regions of the brain. Okay, it's not good. So the central nervous system is protected by a blood-brain barrier, and it's going to regulate what substance enter that brain, which we already talked about a second ago. And tight junctions within capillaries and astrocytes comprise this barrier. Okay, so it's the tight junctions and the astrocytes that are going to build up that blood-brain barrier. Certain things can get through relatively easy. Alcohol can get through the blood-brain barrier easily. Nicotine can get through the blood-brain barrier easily. Your anesthetics, some of those can get through the blood-brain barrier easily, but other drugs cannot pass. So when we look at making drugs that we want to be using in the brain, for example, for Parkinson's disease, we say, oh, the problem in Parkinson's disease is they're not making enough dopamine. Let's just give them more dopamine, right? That should solve the problem. Dopamine doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It doesn't get through those cells. So instead, what we can do is give people L-DOPA, which is the precursor for dopamine, and L-DOPA can cross that blood-brain barrier. So we give it to them in a tablet form, they take it, L-DOPA passes into their brain, and then their brain is able, or cells within their brain, are able to convert the L-DOPA into dopamine and then use that. All right, strokes. We just said this, but it's caused when the blood circulation to the brain is blocked, and then that brain tissue dies. So we said it can only last about 4 minutes without having blood supply. So anything longer than that, we will kill brain tissue. Most commonly, it's caused by a blockage in an artery. One of the cerebral arteries cuts off blood supply, not enough oxygen, not enough glucose, and the brain tissue will die. So what do you think we give people who we think are suffering a stroke if it's due to a blockage? Huh? Aspirin? Aspirin's a weaker form of this, but what's aspirin doing? What's its job? thinning the blood and helping reduce those blood clots. So we have drugs that are a little bit stronger than aspirin that we can give them that are clot busters. So they'll go in there, they'll break down the clots and restart that blood supply to the brain. Okay? So blockage can cause it, but other things can cause it too. Compression of the brain. So if you have a brain injury and your brain swells, or you get fluid on your brain and the brain swells, you are going to block off those arteries. Not because there is a clot in them, but just because you're squeezing them shut. Okay? So that can also reduce your blood flow. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. There are nerves around your brain that help pick up like your headaches or that, but there aren't the nerves that are going in your brain that are feeling pain within your brain. So that's why they could do cut open brain surgery while you're awake. Yeah. So they numb your skin and your stuff on your scalp, and then they cut you open. But your brain is still sitting there, and you're awake, and you can talk to them and tell them what they're doing, which is really weird. Okay. So we can squeeze the blood vessels. We could also have a hemorrhage or edema. We are cutting the blood vessel, and blood is getting out. Okay. If that's happening, things past that injury are not receiving the blood that they need. Okay. Arteriosclerosis. What's that? Yeah, so within your blood vessels is cholesterol is a primary culprit for this. But the inside of your blood vessels get coated with fats and cholesterol and things like that. And so the diameter of your blood vessels shrinks and shrinks and shrinks because of all that nasty stuff just building up on the blood vessel walls. And so that can pinch away the blood supply and reduce the blood to that area as well. Okay, so it doesn't just have to be a blood clot. It can be multiple things. And then transient ischemic attacks are when you have temporary episodes of cerebral ischemia. So that's going to be where you have mini strokes, a lot of mini strokes there together. Okay? All right. 218. Let me get one more slide. I know. Okay, spinal cord. It's kind of here behind the other two classes. Okay, spinal cord. The function is conduction of information. So we send information up to the brain, and we send information down from the brain. Locomotion. We cause our feet to move so that we can move. And finally, control of reflex activity. So there are some movements that only use the spinal cord. So your patellar reflex, when you're sitting on the doctor's table and they hit your knee and your knee pops up, it has nothing to do with your brain. It's the sensory information getting sent to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord is getting information out to your quadriceps to contract. Okay, the spinal cord begins at your foramen magnum, up at the base of your skull, and ends at your first lumbar vertebrae. So it doesn't go all the way down your vertebral column. It's divided into cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions, just like your vertebrae. And the spinal cord gives rise to 31 pairs of nerves, one for each of your vertebrae except C1, and C1 has one above and one below, so he has an extra one. All right. So some gross anatomy, if you're looking at the spinal cord as one long big piece from the top to the bottom, there is going to be a cervical and a lumbar enlargement. Okay, so right around here, your spinal cord gets a little bit bigger, and then your lumbar enlargement down here gets a little bit bigger. Why do you think that you have a cervical and a lumbar enlargement? What's the purpose? What's going on in those areas? The cell bodies that meet, specifically the cell bodies that are going to send nerves to somewhere. Okay. So the cervical enlargement up here send out the nerves to go to your arm. So there's going to be a lot of information right there. And your lumbar enlargement is bigger because you guys send out lots of information to your left. Okay? So that's the purpose of the enlargement. It's just because more information is traveling through that area. Okay? Then at the very bottom, so your spinal cord really only goes to right there. Okay, that's the end. The very end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. where the base is. But then there's still nerves that come out that then exit the spinal cord down in that lumbar region. Okay? So we call this area the cauda equina, or the horse's tail. And it's called the horse's tail because it kind of looks like a horse's tail. So the spinal cord itself is ending here, but those hairy string-like nerves that are going to exit in the lumbar region continue down below it. And so you end up with something that looks like a big fluffy horse's tail at the bottom. Okay? When you're doing a lumbar puncture or you're giving somebody an epidural, you're going to do it in the lumbar region down there. Okay? And the reason you do this is because you're less likely to injure the person by hitting the spinal cord, because the spinal cord itself isn't there. It ended a little bit higher. So all you're squirting into is that horsetail area, and those are nice and fine and thin, and so your needle could kind of push that way. So they're less likely to be damaged. Yes, you have your needle.
So we just need to know the cauda equina?
The cauda equina, yeah.
Okay.
That horse's tail down at the bottom.
Where my mom's got one surgery was doing a lumbar area.
Yeah,
So
so
one of the surgeries was spinal cord fluid leak.
so it might have actually been a safer surgery because you don't have to deal with the whole spinal cord in that area. It's the spinal nerves. All right, and this was part of your quiz on Monday. So you guys should already know your parts. But it says on the objective that you need to know the function of each of the parts. And I have listed the parts over here from your objective, so I make sure that I actually cover everything. Okay, so let's go through the parts together. The first one on your list is white matter columns. Okay, so if you're looking at the cross-section of a spinal cord, you'll see there's white matter and there's gray matter. Okay, the white matter is made up of what? Things that are myelinated. What part of the what part of the neuron is myelinated? Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the white matter is going to be made of myelinated axons. What is the job of an axon in a neuron? Sending signals, right? So the purpose of the white matter in the spinal cord is to send information either up to the brain or down from the brain. So there's ascending columns that send information up, and there's descending columns that send information down. Okay? And so think about this. Remember, this is a cross section, so really the spinal cord is coming out at you this way. And so in that white matter are all those axons that are traveling from the brain back down to the body. Okay? Then the next thing we have is dorsal root ganglion, ventral root. It doesn't say just dorsal root on here, but we'll talk about that too. Okay, so coming out of the spinal cord, everywhere where a spinal nerve comes out, it's actually going to come out in two branches that will fuse together after it gets away from the spinal cord. Okay, so it's going to come out as a ventral root or anterior root, either one is fine. That's coming out the front. And then the dorsal root is going to come out the back, or the posterior root. And then they'll join together to make an actual spinal nerve. Okay, important thing to know on the spinal cord, if it is ventral or anterior, it is always going to be motor. Okay, ventral, anterior is always motor. Dorsal or posterior is always sensory. Okay, so the ventral side, the front side of the spinal cord, is going to be sending information out, and then the back side is going to be sending information in. It's sensory information that comes in. Okay, so if you want to draw a picture, our arrows, dorsal goes in, ventral goes out. Okay, so those are our two roots, our dorsal root and our ventral root. Then the next thing is our dorsal root ganglion. Okay? And the dorsal root ganglion is this enlargement right there. You guys remember from your definition, what is a ganglion? It's a collection of cell bodies. A collection of cell bodies. So this dorsal root ganglion, they've drawn it kind of weird. They've drawn balls and sticks. But you see there's a little dot right there? And then you got your lines. Okay? That's a neuron. What it's supposed to be. So that dot is the cell body. And then the axon is going to send information this way, and we're going to be picking up information from this side. So that dorsal root ganglion is just a collection of all the cell bodies of those sensory neurons that are sending information back to the spinal cord. Okay? So it's enlarged because it has all those cell bodies with their nuclei all bunched up in there. Okay? But again, they're only sensory neurons because sensory neurons are in the dorsal or the posterior side. Okay? All right, so the nose. The central canal. Okay, this one's easy peasy. Central canal. Central means it's in the middle, and the canal is an opening or a hole. So the central canal is right there. The opening in the middle of the spinal cord, and it is filled with fluid. What fluid do you think is going to be inside that thing? Cerebrospinal fluid, exactly. Okay. Then we've got our dorsal horn of the gray matter, the ventral horn of the gray matter, and the gray commissure and the lateral horn of the gray matter. Okay, so that's talking about all of this gray matter here in the middle. Okay, since we're talking about gray matter now, we're getting to cell bodies and we're getting to unmyelinated axons. So maybe they're going only a short distance. Okay, so this is going to be more of the decision making, the reflex center. Okay, it's going to say, do I need to send that information up to the brain? Or can I make a decision right here and cause a reflex? It's going to happen really fast. Okay, so that's going to happen there in the gray matter in the spinal cord itself. Okay, there's 3 different horns. There's the dorsal horn on the back, the ventral horn on the side, or sorry, in the front, and then we have our lateral horn on the side. Okay, and then our key down here tells us what happens in each of these areas. If they're in the back, if they're a dorsal horn, what are they going to be responsible for, sensory or motor? Sensory, okay? So these are going to be interneurons receiving input from the somatic sensory neurons and then from the visceral sensory neurons. So somatic, remember, is skin and muscles. Visceral is all those other organs, okay? So they're going to be little neurons that are picking up the information and deciding, can I do something here or do I need to send it out to the brain for it to decide? And then in your ventral and lateral, those are both going to be your motor neurons. Visceral is lateral, somatic is visceral. Okay? And then the last one I haven't talked about yet is gray commissure. The gray commissure is where it connects in the middle, from one side of the spinal cord to the other. So it's going to send information from one side of the body over to the other side of the body, which is going to be important when we talk about reflexes. One of your reflexes is the cross extensor reflex. Goodness, I'll talk today, which is normal. But the cross extensor reflex is when somebody goes to hit you, which happens all the time, right? Okay, so when somebody goes to hit you, what you're going to do is the side they're coming at, you're going to brace yourself or block. The other side reflexively does what? It's the back. Okay, so that's cross reflexor. Another example of that is if you step on a nail or something with one foot, what are you going to do to that one foot that stepped on something? He's going to go up, and hopefully your other foot holds you up, right, and you don't fall over. Okay, so the information has to go from one side of the spinal cord to the other. So you have to tell, okay, I'm picking up a reflex on this side, I picked up a stimulus on this side, I stepped on something, my other side needs to do something. Okay? So that's what the gray commissure is. It sends information to either side. Okay? What it looks like? What is the gray commissure? All right, any other questions from our spinal cord picture? No? All right, and hopefully you got a chance to see that in lab this week, unless you were yesterday's lab when the power was out. Maybe you didn't, but okay. All right. The next bit of information is about your tracks and your white matter. Now, when you look at your objectives, it will say that you may have to know all of these descending and ascending tracks, but it's up to the instructor's discretion. We have decided that all of those parts, all of those objectives that say up to the instructor's discretion, you don't have to know. Okay? So if it says that at the side, just mark it out. Don't worry about it. So what we're going to expect you to know, instead of all these different tracks and where they go and what they do, just know that in your spinal cord, you have both ascending tracks that are going up to the brain, and you have descending tracks that are going to go down to the brain. Now, there are multiple different tracks that are going to send information to specific locations, but you don't have to worry about that, okay? Just know ascending goes up, descending goes back down. Cool? Y'all okay with that? Okay. just this right here. Ascending tracts carry information up to, and descending tracts carry information out. No, it's fine. It's fine. And then, so I'm glad you said that because I didn't read all of the on the slide to you. If it's sending information up to your brain, what kind of information is it? Sensory or motor? Sensory. And then information going down has to be motor. Okay.
Because you said yesterday that sensory, and I think of when you told that example of touching something hot, it just goes to our spinal cord. And then
Right. So some information are reflexes like that. They just go to your spinal cord, and then in that the gray matter, it decides, oh, we need to reflex and pull back, and it will only stay there. Other sensory information is going to go all the way up. Like how much is your muscle stretched? That's going to go all the way up to your brain because then your motor center has to decide, what am I going to do with that information? Okay. All right. So homeostatic imbalances, things that happen to the spinal cord. Paralysis. Okay. So paralysis is loss of motor function, which happens if there is an injury anywhere in the spinal cord. There are two types of paralysis due to the severity and where the damage is located. Okay, so our first one is flaccid paralysis. Anybody know what the word flaccid means? Okay, so we use this word a lot in biology when we're talking about plants that haven't got enough water. So when a plant hasn't got enough water, what does he look like? He's all droopy. Okay, so flaccid means you're just droopy and there's not activity there. Okay, so flaccid paralysis happens when there is severe damage to the ventral root or the anterior horn cells. Okay, so that's going to happen at the spinal cord level. Okay, the ventral root is the root that's coming out that's going to go and form a spinal nerve that carries motor information away from the spinal cord. If you have an injury there, or if you have an injury there in the anterior horn cells, which are the cell bodies of those anterior root nerves, then you're not going to be able to get any information out to the muscle. Okay? So lower motor neurons are damaged and impulses cannot reach the muscles. They can't get there. There is no voluntary or involuntary control of the muscles because it's disconnected from the spinal cord. Okay? Can't get information. So it's just going to be limp, no movement. Okay, but then we can also have spastic paralysis. Okay? Spastic paralysis is when there's only upper motor neurons of the primary motor cortex that are damaged. That means that that motor neuron is still there, and we still have the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So we can still get in sensory information from that muscle, and we can still send back some small reflex activity from that spinal cord. So we're only getting control from the gray horn that's right there at that spinal cord area. Okay? So sensory information comes in, it may decide we need a quick response and send it out. As long as it doesn't have to go all the way up to the brain, we may still be able to get some activity from those muscles. Okay? So the spinal neurons remain intact, and the muscles can be stimulated irregularly. Okay? But there is no voluntary control because the higher brain centers aren't working anymore. We're just getting those reflex activities. Okay? So it's called spastic because it's not limp. We're getting some movement, but we can't control it. All good? Any questions? Okay. Okay, and we've mentioned this before. Remember that the spinal cord is carrying both sensory and motor information. So what we were looking at before, paralysis, this is loss of motor information. Okay, we have messed up that ventral root, anterior root, which is motor, or we've messed up a motor area in the primary motor cortex. So we're messing up motor activity for this paralysis. But what happens if we cross-section or cut the spinal cord? What else are we going to lose? Not just motor activity, but sensory information. And we'll lose both. So cross-sectioning at any level is going to result in the total loss of motor and sensory in regions that are inferior or below the cut. So we have paraplegia and quadriplegia. Paraplegia is just 2 limbs. Quadriplegia is all 4 limbs. So at what location would you have a cut to cause paraplegia? Would it be in your neck? Where would it be? Lumbar or thoracic. So anywhere between where your arms are and where your legs are. If there's a cut anywhere in this region, from your thoracic to your lumbar region, we're going to lose both sensory and motor activity of those bottom limbs of your legs. Okay? To cause quadriplegia, where would we need a cut or an injury? In your cervical region, this higher area up here. Okay? And then you would lose arm and leg activity. Yeah. So, to lose your motor and sensory control of your limbs only without your legs, you would have to injure the nerves that are coming out from the spinal cord itself. So it wouldn't be a spinal cord injury, because spinal cord injuries, you lose everything below it. But you could lose the activity of the nerve that's coming off the spinal cord that feeds that area. Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, so those are like damage things, like injuries. But we can also cause paralysis with a virus. So poliomyelitis, you'll probably know it as polio, was a horrible, horrible disease that was spread. It was spread normally through the fecal-oral route. What does that mean? Yeah, so fecal, poo, and then oral, mouth. Okay, so it would be transferred from person to person through the fecal-oral route. So community swimming pools were a great place to catch polio. So during these big polio epidemics, they would shut down the community swimming pools, and kids would all stay at home and try not to get sick. But this was an epidemic in America. Okay, in the summers, lots and lots of children would get sick, and lots of them would die from polio. So what happens in poliomyelitis? The virus specifically attacks and destroys those anterior horn motor neurons. Okay, when you do that, you get paralysis. And it would start with light paralysis, like of limbs, but then eventually, so the early symptoms, fever, headache, muscle pain, weakness, and loss of somatic reflexes. But then eventually you would lose the ability to do basic things like breathe, right? Because you need your muscles to do that. Basically, you would lose your ability to breathe, and you would also lose your ability to have a beating heart. Okay, so it would eventually kill you if it got too far. So polio was one of the first guys that we had a vaccine for. We had smallpox, but polio, we have two different vaccines for it, the Salk and the Sabin vaccine. The Salk vaccine is a killed vaccine. So they take the vaccine, they kill it, and they give it to you. The Sabin vaccine is an attenuated vaccine. So they take it and they grow it in some other cells, and it changes a little bit, so it's not quite as infectious. The Sabin vaccine is oral. You eat sugar cubes and you get the vaccine, and then the Salk vaccine is an injection. So we have been able to almost completely eradicate polio in the United States. So I think you guys, I think I'm the generation too, that we didn't get the polio vaccine when we were young because it just doesn't show up anymore. Okay? And all that happened because of vaccines. So we give enough people vaccines, the virus can't infect anybody anymore, so it doesn't have a host, and then it's gone, which is pretty cool. But there are still parts of the world that are suffering from polio. So trying to get vaccines out there is a big thing. But, guys, we can talk a long time about vaccines. I love vaccines. Get your flu shot. Anyway, but there. Yeah, and I probably shouldn't even say what I'm getting ready to say because it's going to get us off topic. But there's a lot of third world countries where we're trying to get out and give them these vaccines so that we can completely eradicate polio. The thing is, governments have used vaccine strategies to do bad things in other countries. So, like spying and other things that aren't very good. So there's lots of countries that are like, nope, you can't come in and do vaccines anymore because you have shown in the past that you're not responsible enough. So, anyway. Right, so this is off topic. The original paper that made the link between vaccines and autism has been retracted, but that scientist made up a bunch of the results. And then there have not been any studies since then that have actually been able to show that there's a link between autism and vaccines.
I met somebody that, like, at the age of, like, well, I knew from his mom that at the age of, like, 2 or 3, he was given vaccines, and then shortly after he went to And so like they think it's because of that. And it's like
Yeah.
they're explaining.
So the thing with that is that autism usually shows up about that age too. So even in, I mean, there aren't many populations of people who don't get vaccines anymore, but still the incidence of autism and when the symptoms show up correlate to the same time that you're giving vaccines. So it's kind of like an overlap thing. So yeah. All right. Another homeostatic imbalance. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. You also may know it as the Lou Gehrig's disease. Have you got, did any of y'all do the ice bucket challenge? Yeah, raise some money to help fight this. So ALS is also a disease that causes paralysis, which we know if you have enough paralysis, you'll eventually die, right? The theme of the class. But ALS, part of some cases of ALS are genetic. You just get it from your parents. In some cases of ALS, they aren't sure what caused it originally. It just happened. So all of that money you raised is working in figuring out what causes it, and then what can we do to prevent it. Okay? But it's destruction of the anterior horn neurons and fibers of the pyramidal tract, which is taking information up and down in the spinal cord. Symptoms starts out with you usually lose the paralysis of limbs, but then eventually ability to speak will be lost, ability to swallow, and ability to breathe will go as well. Death usually occurs within 5 years of diagnosis, so it's a pretty fast disease as well. So linked to the genes for glutamine transporter, and glutamate is one of those neurotransmitters, okay? And it functions too much. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's too active in people with ALS. And it can also be caused by superoxide dismutase, which helps get rid of free radicals, so it's an antioxidant.